I woke to find red flags staked into the ground where my grandfather once showed me how to fish, bright fabric slicing into earth that still bears his footprints, strangers in reflective vests with cameras speaking in that clipped, bureaucratic tone people adopt when they believe forms and signatures make them untouchable. They treated my fence line as if it were nothing more than a polite suggestion. What stung most wasn't the trespass, it was the way they dismissed my voice entirely, talking over me on my own porch as though history itself were an inconvenience. Their badges looked more like props than credentials, like a costume for authority. I'm neither paranoid nor yielding. Tell me in the comments, has anything like this ever happened to you? I'm a construction engineer. I know property boundaries and rights better than most people my age. Years of studying blueprints and wrangling with municipal codes sharpen your instincts for when something doesn't add up. That October morning, coffee in hand on the wraparound porch, I was nearly certain the 3 men in orange vests didn't belong here. They were crouched near the tree line behind our vegetable garden, about 50 yards out, driving metal stakes, topped with bright red flags into the ground, the same kind used before construction crews roll in to tear up a street. My first move was simple. I pulled out my phone and called the county sheriff. This looked like plain trespassing to me, the kind of mix-up that gets cleared up with a firm but polite exchange once law enforcement steps in. The dispatcher logged my report, said they'd send someone out, though her voice hinted my call wasn't top of the stack. I paced the porch. For 20 minutes, watching strangers catalog our land like they were conducting an official survey. Eventually, a deputy rolled up, spoke with the men for 5 minutes, jotted some notes, and headed my way. "This looks like a civil HOA dispute," he said, tilting his hat. "Not a criminal matter. You'll need to go through the proper channels." His tone made me feel like I was the nuisance for reporting intruders on my own property. As he drove off, I felt justice slip to the side of the trespassers. By the time I reached the men, they had finished placing their markers and were photographing our creek. Silver Creek runs through the back of our 14 acres, a waterway in our family since my great-great-grandfather purchased the land after returning from overseas. Now strangers were documenting it like they owned it, measuring, recording, noting flow patterns. When I asked what they were doing, their leader, a heavy man with a clipboard and a dismissive tone, barely glanced at me. "We're conducting an environmental review for the HOA," he said, as if that ended the discussion. He handed me a flyer covered in seals and government-like wording about conservation and community development. The paper was dense with jargon, about watershed protection and environmental stewardship, but the formatting seemed off, like someone had imitated government stationery using cheap software. I pressed them with questions about their authority, but they dodged eye contact and offered no clear answers. That's when my grandfather Walter appeared, 75 years old, wiry and steady, carrying the quiet precision that only military service leaves behind. He stood in the kitchen doorway for half a minute, surveying the scene, then slipped back inside. I heard his closet door creak, the shuffle of something heavy being moved, then his footsteps returning. When he re-emerged on the porch, he carried his old hunting rifle from his army days, not raised, not threatening, just resting at his side, the way you'd carry it while checking fence posts. He walked toward us at his usual calm pace, the same rhythm he brings to farm chores and Sunday church. The effect was immediate. The surveyors froze, shifting all attention to the old soldier. With the rifle, Walter stopped in front of them, eyes fixed on the team leader, and asked evenly, "You boys have authorization certificates for this work?" The man fumbled through an excuse about HOA clearance, waving his clipboard like it could magically turn intrusion into legitimacy. Walter let him finish, then followed with another question. "Do you have legal warrants?" His voice was calm but unyielding. Something in his posture said he wasn't going to settle for vague answers. The silence that followed stretched, filled only by birdsong and the steady flow of Silver Creek, natural reminders of how out of place these men were here. Then, without a word, the three packed up. Gear, cameras, flags, everything loaded into their white pickup in record time. They drove off without apology or explanation. Walter stood watching them leave, rifle still at his side. At the porch steps, he paused, looked at me, and with a glint of dry humor said, That's the 6th time they've sent people onto our land. 6. His casual delivery hit me like a punch. I spent the rest of the morning studying the flyer they left behind. Green Line Environmental Assessment Phase 1, it read, stamped with logos that looked official until you stared at them long enough to see the flaws. The wording overflowed with phrases about watershed protection and community enhancement, but buried deep in the fine print were passages about land use changes and development rights that made my stomach knot. Walter found me at the kitchen table, still poring over the document. He poured himself coffee, sat across from me, and studied my expression with the patience of a man who dealt with bureaucratic games longer than I'd been alive. Your great-great-grandpa fought for this land twice, he said. Once overseas and once again in court. Looks like it's our turn now. The weight of his words settled heavy. This wasn't just a property line dispute or a clash with an HOA. It was about whether our family would keep hold of the land passed down through generations. Thought for one mem 14's eye couldn't tell whether I'd just seen an incursion or the first move toward something much worse. The next morning I drove into town to the county land office, a low brick box that smells like old paper and bureaucratic irritation. I needed to know exactly what legal power, if any, an HOA holds over environmental assessments on private land. Inside, the fluorescence buzzed. The clerk, a thin woman with reading glasses on a chain, pulled up our property file and frowned as she scrolled. According to the updated boundary chart, she said, "Your parcel's been flagged for a potential watershed impact assessment, but there's an issue. State law requires written notice to property owners at least 30 days before any such evaluation begins." I leaned in to study the screen. We'd received no notice, no letters, no calls, no HOA announcements, nothing. Her frown deepened as she opened more records. She brought up a digital copy of a consent form for the assessment, complete, with a signature that was supposed to be mine, though I'd never laid eyes on the document. She squinted, enlarged the signature block, and turned the monitor toward me. "To be honest, this looks off," she said carefully. "I'll need to file a verification report with the county attorney's office." The handwriting was clumsy and uneven, the ink smeared like it came from a bargain copier. While I was still processing that, a familiar voice sounded behind me. "Dean Mallister, right? How's the settling in?" I turned to find Rick Larson, the Greenspire development rep I'd heard about at neighborhood meetings but hadn't met. He was shorter than I'd imagined, early 50s, with an overeager grin that makes you want to check your wallet. He came up with his hand out, radiating weaponized cheer. "Just happened to be in the area checking on some community development paperwork," he said, sneaking a glance at the clerk's screen. "Funny running into you." The timing felt staged, like he'd been waiting. I didn't bother with small talk. "Funny thing, Rick. Your environmental assessment team trespassed on my family's land yesterday. We never authorized any surveys, and it looks like someone forged my name on the consent form." His smile faltered for a heartbeat, then reappeared. "That must be some administrative mix-up," he said with a laugh that sounded practiced. "But here's the upside, Dean. If this area is designated a protected conservation zone, your property value could double overnight. Serious money. Environmental stewardship is good business for everyone. Imagine your land as part of an official conservation corridor." "Environmental stewardship that starts with unlawful entry onto private property?" I asked. His demeanor shifted. He shuffled papers in his briefcase. "The HOA has broad authority for community improvement initiatives," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "These assessments help everyone's financial future." When I pressed him on whether proper notice had been given, he dodged into chatter about market trends. The county clerk had been listening, interest growing. When Rick finished, she cleared her throat, and I spent the rest of my time there researching Greenspire and its prior projects. What I found explained Rick's nerves. For the past 5 years, every development followed the same pattern. Partner with local HOAs to run environmental assessments, identify zones for ecotourism or conservation-themed projects, then build luxury resorts dressed up as nature preserves. The document sketched a company adept at twisting environmental rules toward commercial gain. Again and again, the path ran from conservation assessment to high-end development, while local residents lost access to land they believed was being protected for future generations. Suddenly, Rick's fixation on property values made sense. He wasn't trying to preserve our neighborhood's natural character. Before I left, Rick made one last attempt to salvage things. He pulled a paper from his briefcase and handed it over with that same pasted-on smile. "Just a retroactive consent form," he said. "This will clear up the authorization confusion. Nothing complicated, just a formality to keep everything above board." One look told me he wanted me to bless the trespass after the fact. I declined his generous offer and walked out with more questions than answers, but with a much clearer idea of what we were up against. This wasn't just about assessments or HOA authority, it was a coordinated effort to separate families from land they'd held for generations, using environmental protection as a cover for commercial development. The forged signature was only the beginning. If they'll forge names today, tomorrow they might forge entire boundary maps, and when maps move, history disappears. That evening, Walter was waiting in the living room with an old leather journal. Open on the coffee table, the pages were yellowed, the careful handwriting in blue ink faded almost to gray. "This belonged to your great-great-grandpa," he said, motioning me to sit. He kept meticulous notes on every boundary dispute, every legal fight, every attempt by outsiders to claim what wasn't theirs. But tonight, I need to show you something that changes everything. I leaned over the cramped lines, working. Through the old-fashioned script. March 15th, 1962. County assessor claims creek runs 10 FT east of actual location. Hired surveyor to prove them wrong. Cost $47, but worth every penny. Walter flipped to a page I'd never seen. "Here's what he discovered in 1964, he said, pointing to an entry that chilled me. "Found family grave markers moved 30 FT west. Someone's been stealing our dead along with our land." He spent 3 years in court getting Silver Creek designated a protected watershed, Walter added. He knew that if they controlled the water, they'd eventually control everything around it. Then he reached under the table and drew out 2 rolled documents. "This is the original military survey map from 1964, he said, unrolling the first with care, and here's the map Greenspire had been relying on. For years, someone inside the county office had been keeping 2 versions of our property lines. The differences were shocking. According to official county records, our boundary had mysteriously shifted about 30 feet closer to the house, stripping away a large stretch of creek bank that had always been ours. But Greenspire's internal records still showed the true lines, proof that they knew exactly what they were taking and had been orchestrating this theft for decades. It was deliberate. The public maps had been tampered with, while the development maps stayed accurate. Walter's face darkened as he laid it all out. "This is the 6th time they've sent crews onto our land," he said, pulling out a small notebook packed with his observations. Then he looked me straight in the eye. "Dean, we need to make this public. The longer we wait, the more evidence disappears." I stared at him, feeling the weight pressing down on me. "You want to go up against a development company that's got county officials in its pocket?" I asked. His eyes blazed with resolve. "Sometimes you have to choose between being safe and being right," we argued, short but heated. Walter wanted immediate exposure. I worried about lawsuits, retaliation, about putting targets on our backs. "This isn't just fraud," I said. "They've been plotting this for decades." Walter listened, but his reply cut through my hesitation. "If we don't fight now, there won't be anything left worth fighting for." Then he showed me the scope of what he'd been documenting, photos taken right from his bedroom window. Every single incursion had been logged with military precision. "They talk about phases and construction schedules like this place already belongs to them," he said, "as if our family's claim is just a temporary inconvenience. But those photos revealed more. The survey teams had been photographing our home, our routines, even the times we left for town." A chill ran through me. All of this had been happening right under my nose. While I was busy trying to rebuild life after my divorce, Walter had been waging a silent battle to guard our legacy. The guilt hit hard as I realized my grandfather had been enduring months of targeted harassment. keeping watch, recording everything, while I stayed blind to it all. Walter pulled out more proof. The forged county map wasn't a one-off. For at least 6 months, someone with access to county records had been systematically altering files tied to our property. Tax assessments were adjusted to reflect smaller lots. Utility easements redrawn to favor developers. Even our water rights had been reassigned to a regional authority that hadn't existed when my great-great-grandfather staked our claim. The most disturbing? Permits filed under our address without our knowledge, environmental studies, contamination reports, wildlife, surveys, all authorized with falsified signatures. Walter had copies of everything, gathered through persistence and relentless questioning of county staff who had no idea how much they were revealing. The breakthrough came when Walter showed me signature comparisons he'd been working on. He matched the forged authorizations with handwriting samples from county employees. The similarities were undeniable. There was an insider, someone in the office feeding Greenspire their cover. As the scale of it sank in, I saw this wasn't about permits or environmental reports. This was a calculated dismantling of our heritage, engineered through forged records and insider corruption. Every shifted boundary, every falsified right, every fraudulent assessment was a stake being driven into our claim. The survey flags weren't markers. They were claim posts. The next morning, walking to the mailbox, I found an unmarked envelope. Inside was a single photo, grainy, taken at night. It showed Walter patrolling our land with his rifle. If they're willing to forge official government documents, what kind of enemy am I really up against? That afternoon, I decided to talk to our neighbors. I needed to know how the HOA had gotten authority to run environmental studies in the first place. Someone had to have signed something, approved something, voted on something that gave Greenspire access to private property. My first stop was the Thompson house, a couple streets away. Mrs. Thompson had lived here 23 years and usually knew every rumor within a 5-mile radius. If anyone could explain, it was her. I found her in the yard, tending a flower bed that probably cost more than most people's mortgages. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Dean, how lovely to see you," she said warmly, straightening with the slow stiffness of age. "I hope you're settling in with Walter. He's such a treasure." Her kindness made my question even harder. I explained about the survey crews and the forged records. Her smile faded into puzzled concern. "That's strange," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Darla came by about 6 weeks ago with papers about environmental protection. She said her late husband would have wanted us to preserve the character of the community. I felt sorry for her after Frank passed, so I signed. She made it sound like a simple conservation pledge. Inside, she laid out a folder of HOA documents. Spread across the table, the truth was obvious. What she signed was nothing like what she thought. The paper was titled Environmental Impact Assessment Authorization Agreement. Hidden in the fine print were sweeping clauses granting survey rights to any HOA-approved consultant, with full access to all watershed properties, including ours. Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened as she reread it. "This isn't what Darla said. She told me it was just about preserving property values, keeping the area rural. Nothing about survey rights." She looked betrayed, realizing she'd been tricked into giving up rights she hadn't even known. She held. Yet she added softly, "But Dean, Darla's done so much since her husband died. Maybe we should give her the benefit of the doubt." I spent the rest of the day knocking on doors. The responses varied. At the Martinez home, the owner she wasn't just misled. She was part of it. She was a widow, fighting to keep her house by sacrificing everyone else's property rights, using calculated deception disguised as mourning. At another house, I was met with open hostility. The elderly homeowner grew more agitated as I laid out the legal violations hidden in the environmental assessments. "You're the one stirring up trouble in this neighborhood," he snapped, his arthritic finger jabbing at my chest. "Everything was peaceful before you came here, accusing good people of fraud. Darla's a decent woman trying to honor her late husband, and you're smearing her with these outrageous conspiracy theories. If you don't like the way we do things, maybe you should move back to wherever you came from." In that moment, I began to understand why Darla's campaign had been so persuasive. She wasn't only manipulating grief or environmental concerns, she was also exploiting long-standing rifts between old residents and newcomers, financial anxieties about property values, and the natural instinct to trust familiar faces over uncomfortable truths. Frank had truly cared about conservation, but Darla was twisting his memory into a weapon, using it to pit the community against anyone who dared question her authority. By the end of the day, after visiting 8 different homes, I realized the neighborhood was far more fractured than I had imagined. Some residents had been sincerely misled by Darla's emotional tactics, others signed, fully aware they might benefit from development, a few reacted with open hostility toward anyone challenging the norm. The legal wording had been intentionally vague, but the community's response revealed a deeper sickness. Darla wasn't just orchestrating fraud, she was exploiting desperation and division, turning neighbors against one another. As I walked home that evening, the true weight of what we were up against hit me. This wasn't merely about property rights or regulatory loopholes, it was about systemic deceit. Trust within the community being manipulated by someone who knew exactly how to weaponize compassion for her own survival. Every signature Darla gathered represented another family tricked into surrendering protections they didn't even know they had, and some didn't even care as long as profit was involved. The most chilling part was realizing our community had already been divided. Long before this crisis began, when I reached my mailbox, my blood ran cold. One of the red survey flags had been replanted in our front yard. This time, a handwritten note was attached. "This isn't over." Armed with evidence of forged documents and systematic deception, I knew it was time to push for a public confrontation. With the HOA board, I called Darla directly, demanding an emergency community assembly to address the procedural violations we had uncovered. She tried to dismiss me, claiming environmental assessments were just routine HOA business that didn't require a special meeting, but I pressed her with exact legal citations about property owner notification requirements. When I mentioned the documentation proving residents had been misled, her tone shifted from dismissive to uneasy. This meeting would decide whether the community stood together or shattered completely. The emergency assembly was scheduled for Thursday at 7 p.m. at the community center, a cramped building that smelled of stale coffee and decades of neighborhood disputes. I arrived early, armed with a folder of evidence. Walter's photos of unauthorized intrusions, copies of forged county documents, and signed statements from neighbors who admitted they'd been deceived about what they had authorized. The room filled slowly with residents, most of them puzzled about why they were suddenly being asked to discuss environmental assessments they barely remembered signing. Others entered reluctantly, faces tight with resistance. Darla called the meeting to order, her usual confidence giving way to the jittery tension of someone about to be exposed. She tried to limit discussion to routine HOA matters, but I cut her off with a direct challenge. Darla, explain to everyone here why the HOA failed to give the required 30-day written notice before conducting environmental assessments as required. By state law, the room fell silent. Many were hearing about notification rules for the first time. But Darla had prepared. Instead of faltering, she squared her shoulders and looked at me with cold composure. "Dean, everyone knows you've been spreading false accusations since you moved back here after your divorce. The so-called legal violations were caused by a rogue board member who exceeded his authority and has already been removed. We've been trying to fix the mess he left behind, but your interference has made it impossible to resolve things quietly." She gestured toward the crowd, her voice dripping with authority. "I think we all know who the real troublemaker is." The atmosphere shifted. Several residents began nodding, accepting her version of events that cast her as the victim and me as the villain. But I wasn't about to let her rewrite the truth. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the projector I'd brought for displaying the evidence. "Let's review the actual documents," I said, my hands steady despite the anger boiling inside me. "These forged signatures and altered boundaries tell a very different story than the one Darla is feeding you." The projector flickered, then filled the screen with static and distortion. Someone had sabotaged the equipment, likely during the chaos as people entered. Darla's smile widened, confidence returning. Technical difficulties, Dean? She asked sweetly. Maybe that's a sign you should stop trying to manufacture. Problems. I fumbled with the connections, but residents were already losing interest, murmuring among themselves. Without visual proof, my accusations seemed hollow. Just as I was about to give up, Walter's voice sliced through the noise, sharp and undeniable. Who sold the creek rights? The question dropped like a hammer, instantly silencing the room. Walter hadn't burst into the room with theatrics or fanfare. He simply appeared in the doorway and asked the one question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Darla's face drained of color as she realized Walter wasn't about to be sidetracked by technical glitches or personal attacks. His question went directly to the legal breach that could unravel the entire scheme. The mood in the room shifted. Sharply, from irritated confusion to a heavy sense of dread, as people began to grasp the weight of Walter's words. If the creek rights had been sold or transferred without the proper authorization, it meant someone had been siphoning off their water resources along with their property rights. Darla struggled to keep her composure, but her voice betrayed her, with the slightest crack as she tried to brush Walter aside. I don't know what you mean, Mr. Mallister. The creek rights have always been under the Regional Water Authority, completely separate from HOA matters. But instead of calming the crowd, her response only made things worse. Walter entered the room at his usual deliberate pace, carrying with him the quiet authority of a man shaped by decades of military service and an unshakable sense of duty. No, ma'am, he said evenly, pulling a folded paper from his jacket. The creek rights were transferred to Greenspire Development Corporation 6 months ago, using forged signatures from homeowners who never consented. This is a copy of the official county record of that transfer. He handed the document to the nearest neighbor, who passed it along as alarm spread across the room. At that same moment, I finally restored the projector feed. Now the screen displayed the forged signatures, doctored boundary maps, and falsified environmental approvals Darla had obtained through manipulation. The combination of Walter's revelation and the damning visuals unleashed a wave of outrage that Darla couldn't deflect or explain away. Residents erupted with angry questions, demanding answers about the violations that threatened every property in the watershed. Darla's carefully rehearsed defenses collapsed under the weight of the evidence. She tried to cut off the discussion, claiming that residents had misunderstood technical language, but her interruptions only made her look more culpable. When I pointed out that the documents contained legal authorization wording hidden beneath layers of environmental jargon, she finally admitted what I had been waiting for. We had to move quickly, she confessed. The environmental assessment timeline left no room for lengthy community consultations. The deadlines forced us to expedite the process. That single admission was enough. Darla had just acknowledged, on record, that the HOA knowingly violated state notification laws in order to push through their development plans. It was, in essence, a public confession of procedural fraud. The room exploded with fury. Neighbors shouted over one another, some demanding Darla's resignation, others already talking about lawsuits against the board. A few stormed out in disgust. Later, as I walked to my car through the chaos of the meeting's aftermath, I noticed our mailbox hanging open. Inside, where the usual bills and flyers should have been, there was only one thing: the original 1964 military survey map. Every other document Walter had safeguarded was gone. Someone had stolen all of it. That recording we'd made, it could either be the decisive weapon I needed or the piece of evidence that would destroy me. The next morning I reached out to Sarah Mitchell, a property rights attorney whose downtown office tower radiated expensive authority. She specialized in HOA disputes and municipal regulatory cases, the exact expertise I needed to turn our evidence into a legal battle plan. When I played Darla's recorded confession about bypassing community consultation, Sarah leaned back, in her leather chair, her expression that of someone who'd just been handed a victory on a silver platter. "This recording is gold," she said, replaying the clip where Darla admitted to violating state notification requirements. "HOA boards have very clear legal duties when it comes to property assessments. Your evidence proves they deliberately ignored those laws. We can pursue them for procedural violations, breach of fiduciary duty, and even fraud, depending on how far this goes." She pulled out a legal pad and began sketching a strategy, explaining how we could use the recording to invalidate every consent form signed under false pretenses. While Sarah mapped out the legal battle ahead, I resolved to dig deeper into Greenspire development myself. Pretending to be a prospective investor with an interest in environmental preservation projects, I reached out to their corporate headquarters and asked for detailed information on their current development plans. Within 48 hours, a package arrived by overnight courier, overflowing with documents that revealed far more than I was prepared to know about their intentions for our community. With shaky hands, I opened the envelope and uncovered a full-scale development proposal labeled Silver Creek Conservation Resort and Recreational Facility. Inside was a polished brochure featuring glossy renderings of luxury cabins, a championship-level golf course, and a high-end spa complex, all slated to rise directly on our family's land. According to the timeline, construction was to commence within 6 months, pending the completion of environmental impact reviews, but the most alarming discovery wasn't in the brochure. It was a video presentation where Rick unveiled his Preserve to Profit strategy, boasting to investors about exploiting grief and environmental concerns as a way to seize family properties. What chilled me most was how perfectly the materials mirrored our own neighborhood. The maps were too precise to be guesswork. They detailed existing homes and natural features with accuracy that could only have come from unauthorized, on-the-ground reconnaissance. The plan outlined that 12 homes, including ours, would need to be acquired to create a continuous conservation corridor for the resort. Sarah examined the documents closely, her concern growing as she flagged several legal inconsistencies that suggested outright fraud. "The proposal claims environmental impact studies were finished 18 months ago," she pointed out, "but your HOA only began collecting consent forms 6 weeks back. That means Greenspire was moving ahead with development long before anyone in the community authorized environmental studies. Digging deeper, we discovered the deception ran even further. County records showed Greenspire had already submitted. That afternoon, walking to my car, I felt the enormity of what we were about to set in motion. The evidence was airtight, the legal plan was solid, and Sarah was confident we'd prevail both criminally and civilly. But I also knew that shining light on this conspiracy would make us targets for people already willing to forge documents and manipulate government files. As I approached my car, I caught sight of a black SUV with tinted windows trailing me for 3 blocks before blending back into traffic. Tomorrow, we'd no longer be passive victims. We'd be direct challengers to a multi-million-dollar development scheme backed by people who clearly disregarded laws and ethics alike. This wasn't just a fight with a corporation anymore. I was being hunted. 2 days after meeting with Sarah Mitchell, I woke to find another survey crew near Silver Creek. This time there were 4 men instead of 3, armed with more advanced equipment, electronic meters, and what appeared to be soil testing tools. They moved with the confidence of people convinced they had full authority, brushing aside the fact that we'd already exposed their fraudulent paperwork days earlier. I realized then this would be the final showdown, and I wanted the entire world to see it. I set my phone to live stream, angling it to capture both our land and the creek where the men worked. "If they've sent another crew for their so-called environmental assessment," I told my growing online audience, "then everyone's about to witness exactly how these developers operate when they think no one's paying attention." Viewers multiplied quickly. Dozens became hundreds as people shared the stream and chimed in with stories of their own HOA battles. The crew leader this time was unfamiliar to me. Tall, clipboard in hand, carrying himself like someone used to bullying landowners into submission. When I approached, camera still rolling, he barely looked up. "We have full legal authority to complete this environmental evaluation," he said flatly. "The HOA has granted us access to conduct the necessary watershed assessments." His tone suggested my objections were meaningless red tape. I held my phone steady, making sure the stream caught his face and his claims. "Show me the permits," I said, addressing both him and the viewers. "Let's see the paperwork that supposedly gives you the right to be on my family's land without consent." Visibly irritated, he pulled out a folder of official-looking documents, too familiar in all the wrong ways. "The property owner signed off," he said, pointing to the same forged signature I'd already uncovered at the county office. "That signature is a forgery," I declared loudly for the live stream, zooming in with my phone. "We've already filed fraud complaints with the county attorney about these falsified authorizations." His confidence faltered when he realized he was being broadcast to hundreds, but he quickly shifted back to HOA jargon about jurisdiction and environmental protections. Meanwhile, the chat exploded with outrage. At that moment, Rick Larson arrived, this time with a so-called security guard who looked more like hired muscle. Rick tried his usual charm, but the live stream stripped his manipulations bare. "Dean, you're stirring up unnecessary drama over routine environmental stewardship," he said, shooting nervous glances at my phone. Viewers weren't buying it. Comments poured in from people who recognized his tactics, many sharing stories of similar schemes in their neighborhoods. Others offered legal guidance. That real-time flood of support gave me the push to stand even firmer against Rick's spin. Everything shifted when the crew began driving new markers into the ground by Silver Creek. Despite my protests and the live broadcast, they pressed ahead, treating our land as if it were abandoned property for their convenience. When I stepped toward their equipment, the guard moved in, signaling they were ready to use force if necessary. That's when Walter emerged from the house with his hunting rifle. His steady walk toward the creek carried the same calm resolve. He'd shown at the community meeting, but this time it was different. The livestream audience watched every second, the chat exploding with admiration for the elderly veteran standing firm against corporate trespassers. Walter stopped about 20 feet from the men and spoke in his clear, unshakable voice. "You're trespassing on private property. Leave now." The guard made the mistake of charging toward him, clearly assuming a 75-year-old could be scared off. Walter lifted his rifle and fired a single shot into the sky. The crack echoed over the creek and through the livestream audio, sending viewership soaring as people shared the video everywhere. "That was a warning," Walter said evenly. "The next shot won't be." The crew froze, equipment abandoned, all eyes locked on Walter. Rick shouted about calling the police, which struck me as darkly ironic considering we'd been begging law enforcement to step in from the start. "Go." "On then," I yelled back, making sure the livestream captured every word. "Call them. I've been begging them to look into your fraud for weeks." The security guard edged away from Walter, clearly rethinking his role in the intimidation. In the distance, the rising wail of sirens grew louder as several patrol cars closed in on the property. I kept the stream rolling as officers pulled up, ensuring everything was documented for my audience and for legal records. When the first officer asked for an explanation, I handed him the evidence binder, complete with forged signatures, fraud, documentation, and Sarah Mitchell's legal breakdown of the procedural violations we had uncovered. Viewers watched in real time as the police examined our materials and began questioning the survey crew about why they were on our land in the first place. That was the moment Greenspire's scheme unraveled live on camera. Rick had no legitimate permits for the environmental survey. His crew had zero legal authority to be evaluating private land. The security guard wasn't even licensed in our county. Every piece of their operation was exposed as illegal. The tension peaked when officers revealed Rick had outstanding warrants in 2 other states for similar development scams. The man posing as a respected environmental consultant was, in fact, a wanted criminal who made a career of tricking rural communities with fake conservation projects. My viewers saw the moment Rick was handcuffed and shoved into a patrol car, his polished salesman act demolished by the weight of law enforcement. The truth was finally undeniable, but a question lingered. Would this really be the end of it? By the next morning, every local news station was leading with the live stream that had blown open a multi-state development fraud operation. Overnight, my video was shared thousands of times, reaching people nationwide who had faced the same HOA, overreach, and corporate land grabs. Headlines blared, "Environmental consultant arrested at gunpoint during illegal property survey." What began as our family's fight had ignited a national debate about property rights and corruption in development. Within 3 days, the legal fallout was in motion. Rick Larson was officially charged with fraud, trespassing, and violating environmental regulations. His outstanding warrants in Arizona and Nevada brought federal charges for interstate fraud and conspiracy. The guard he'd brought along was charged with operating without a license and trying to intimidate witnesses during an active investigation. Greenspire Development Corporation was suddenly under the scrutiny of both state and federal investigators. Thanks to the live stream evidence, the company was forced to abandon projects in our region, pay heavy fines for environmental violations, and had its assets frozen while civil lawsuits poured in from communities across the country who'd been duped by similar schemes. The emergency HOA meeting that followed was unlike anything our neighborhood had seen. Instead of a handful of uninterested residents, the community center was overflowing with furious homeowners who now understood how deeply they had been betrayed. Darla tried clinging to her role as president, but the vote to oust her was unanimous. Except for her own ballot, Mrs. Thompson stood and addressed her directly. "We trusted you to lead this community, and you sold us out to criminals." Darla's downfall was swift. She lost her HOA position, faced charges of fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, and was hit with multiple lawsuits from residents. The kickbacks she'd pocketed from Greenspire were seized as evidence, and with mounting legal fees, she ultimately lost her home to foreclosure. The woman who thought she could protect her house by betraying her neighbors ended up with nothing. Meanwhile, the former county employee who falsified records was tracked down in Florida and extradited back to face charges of forgery, misconduct, and conspiracy. Her cooperation with federal investigators revealed just how wide Greenspire's network reached: 7 states, each with the same formula of bribing local officials and forging community consent. The most rewarding moment came at a community barbecue Walter and I were honored at in the park beside Silver Creek. Neighbors gathered with food, kids ran across the grass, and families that had barely spoken before shared laughter and music. The Martinez family flipped burgers while organizing games for the children. Another neighbor strummed his guitar, leading sing-alongs of old folk tunes. Mrs. Thompson approached Walter with tears streaming down her cheeks. "My husband fought in Korea," she told him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "He would have done exactly what you did to defend our neighborhood." Walter, ever modest, gave a small nod. "Your husband knew some things are worth defending," he said quietly. But I could see her words meant more to him than he would admit. The court victories mattered, but what struck me most was the personal shift. Moving back in with Walter after my divorce hadn't been an escape. It had prepared me to embrace a purpose, defending family heritage and community values. The engineering skills I once thought useless in rural life had become vital. Walter spent an afternoon showing me how to maintain the original military boundary maps and legal papers that safeguarded our land. He taught me how to store survey records, file annual confirmations with the county, and track any future attempts to tamper with our property lines. He was passing the responsibility of protecting our heritage from his generation to mine. The federal probe later revealed that Greenspire had been running similar cons across multiple rural states, targeting areas rich in natural resources where populations were aging. Our livestream confrontation provided the crucial proof that collapsed their entire network. After that, no more survey crews showed up. No more red flags dotted Silver Creek. No strangers wandered onto our land pretending to have authority. Walter's rifle went back into his closet, but the message it carried remained. We would defend what was ours. 3 months later, Walter and I sat on the porch watching the sun set over Silver Creek. The water flowed calmly through the land, tracing the same path it always had, long before developers tried to divert it for golf course irrigation. The flags were gone. The equipment was gone. The threat was gone. Breaking the quiet, Walter pointed at the old oak near the creek. "Tomorrow we'll bury a time capsule there," he said. "We'll put the original boundary map inside, copies of all the court documents, and a single rifle bullet. That way, future generations will know exactly how this land was defended. The land remained unchanged, but its story had been forever altered. Walter's rifle hadn't spilled blood, but it had destroyed the illusion that forged papers and fake seals outweighed memory and resolve. Maybe the real lesson is that even the smallest act of defiance, by one old man on his porch, can unravel the largest deception. If you've stayed with me this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this fight resonated with you, hit like, subscribe, or tap the thanks button below to support us. Stay sharp, stay stubborn, and never let anyone redraw your map. Thanks for watching QA Stories. If you enjoyed this one, be sure to like and subscribe for more unbelievable tales coming your way.